The Capital Stack That Built the City, Part 1, by Gevorg Yeghikyan, June 1, 2026. Why Paris Built Apartments and London Built Row Houses, the Political Economy of Continental and Anglo-Urban Form. The 1910 Gap. In 1700, the major Western cities looked broadly alike. Walking through London, Paris, Amsterdam, Madrid, Berlin, Rome, Naples, or Brussels, you would have passed mostly low-rise, narrow-fronted buildings, what we would today call row houses or townhouses, single buildings each held in some local approximation of freehold. There were exceptions. Edinburgh's Old Town had its tall stone lands. A few Roman insulae survived in pieces of Naples and Rome. The grand Italian palazzi of Genoa and Venice were subdivided across their stories, but the dominant urban dwelling from Madrid to Manchester was a single house, ground to roof, with one front door.
Image. A historic European city waterfront is lined with mostly narrow, multi-story townhouses standing beside a large civic building and a church. Small boats and carts appear along the quay, with pedestrians moving through an urban scene dominated by low-rise individual buildings.
Hôtel de Ville et Place de Grève, 1753, Paris, Musée Carnavalet. The City Hall of Paris and typical urban dwelling form in the 18th century. By 1910, a hard line ran across the west. On one side were London, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, Bristol, Brooklyn, Boston, Philadelphia, Amsterdam, Antwerp, Brussels, row-house cities, with narrow plot frontages, low-rise terraces or detached and semi-detached houses, mostly built by small jobbing builders and, where they were owned at all, held by petty proprietors.
Image. A series of attached urban houses have tall, narrow frontages of about 3 to 4 stories, each occupying a slim plot. Their floor plans are long and narrow, with rooms arranged in sequence from the street toward the rear garden and staircases set to one side.
Facade variations on a repetitive row house plan, as published by Fernand Salmain from 1908 to 1913, courtesy of Gérald Ledant, Brussels Housing, Atlas of Residential Building Types. On the other side were Paris, Berlin, Vienna, Madrid, Barcelona, Milan, Turin, Budapest, Rome, apartment cities, 5 to 8 stories tall, built around courtyards on enormous blocks, owned by rentier corporations or landed estates and inhabited overwhelmingly by tenants.
Image. Around 1900, dense rental tenements filled large city blocks, with multi-story apartment buildings wrapped around interior courtyards. The blocks formed continuous street walls, leaving most open space enclosed inside the buildings.
Berlin Mietskaserne, Kasea 1900. Courtesy Patrick Verhoeven. The single best comparative measure of the gap comes from a cross-section of 1,095 cities across 27 countries, drawn from late 19th and early 20th century census data. Measured as persons per residential building, English industrial cities had an urban density of roughly 5 to 6, Greater London and Belgian cities around 8. The Dutch were already a little higher, Amsterdam 14, Rotterdam 11. Paris, on the other hand, with 38 persons per residential building, sits at the higher end. The Central European capitals were higher still, Vienna 52, Budapest 44, Madrid 43. Berlin and Hamburg around 29 citywide, but with individual inner districts reading in the high 50s. At the extreme, Warsaw climbed to 116 persons per residential building, a number that is hard even to picture. On this morphological measure, the continental and the Anglo-Dutch sides were separated by a full order of magnitude.
Image. Around 1910, Warsaw had about 116 persons per residential building, far above Vienna at about 52, Budapest and Madrid at about 44 and 43, Paris at 38, and Berlin at about 29. Milan was about 23, while Glasgow, Manhattan, and Amsterdam were around 14. Brussels, Boston, and London were around 8, and Manchester was about 5.
The continental cluster sits at 20 to 90 plus persons per building. The Anglo-Dutch cluster sits at 5 to 8 persons per building. The gap is one order of magnitude. Of course, the pattern was not absolute, and the exceptions matter. There were apartments in the Anglo world, Manhattan's Lower East Side dumbbell tenements. About 70% of New York's 5-borough population lived in tenements by 1900. Glasgow's sandstone tenements, parts of Chicago and Boston. Conversely, there were row houses on the continent, the bourgeois working-class quarters of Lyon, certain German industrial towns, the Brussels and Antwerp townhouse. Each of these exceptions has a specific mechanism, and we'll work through them as we introduce our framework revealing the forces producing urban morphology. A second dimension is worth introducing here. Around 1900, essentially everyone in both kinds of city was a renter. 3/4 of London households were tenants in the early modern period, reaching further up to 90% rental into the 1910s. On the continent, the rental share was higher still, over 90% in Wilhelmine Berlin and fin de siècle Vienna. So the contrast that matters is not rental continent versus owner-occupier Anglo, but the form of the development and the capital structure that owned it. The 20th century rearranged the tenure pattern twice. Between 1918 and the early 2000s, the Anglo world became majority owner-occupier. The US peaked at 69% in 2004, the UK at 70.4% in 2003. The continent retrofitted owner-occupation onto apartments through new horizontal property laws, the Italian condominio of 1934, the French copropriété of 1938 and 1965, the German Wohnungseigentumsgesetz of 1951, Spanish Propiedad Horizontal of 1960, Swiss Stockwerkagentum of 1965, and the Eastern European mass privatizations after 1990.
Image. Home ownership rose in both countries over the 20th century, with the United Kingdom climbing from about 10% in 1900 to a peak of about 70.4% in the early 2000s. The United States started much higher, at roughly 47% in 1900, rose sharply after 1940, peaked at 69% in 2004, and then both countries settled in the mid-60s by the 2020s.
US and UK home ownership rates, 1900 to 2024. Both series rise across the 20th century from minority owner-occupation to a 2003 UK peak of 70.4% and a less dramatic but significant climb, reaching a peak of 69% in 2004 in the US, before retreating after the global financial crisis. The institutional rental wave of the 2010s and 2020s starts from these post-peak levels. Sources: US Census Bureau, English Housing Survey. From the 2010s, the institutional rental form has been returning. By 2022, the four largest U.S. single-family rental landlords together held more than 200,000 homes. In 2011, no single firm held more than 1,000. Build-to-rent has risen from under 2% of U.S. new single-family starts in the 1990s to over 7% today, with at least 68,000 new BTR starts in 2025 alone. In Europe, Blackstone, Vonovia, Acalius, and Heimstaden together own hundreds of thousands of apartments across Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Spain. The first major American institutional rental construction wave since 1929 is underway. The pace shows up in the construction statistics.
Image. Single-family built-for-rent housing accounted for about 2% of U.S. single-family starts in 1990 and stayed mostly below 3% through the early 2000s. Its share rose sharply after the late 2000s, peaked at 9% in the fourth quarter of 2024, and then fell to 7.2% in the third quarter of 2025.
Build-to-rent share of U.S. new single-family housing starts, 1990 to 2025. The series rises from below 2% in the early 1990s to over 7% in 2024, with 2025 starts at roughly 68,000 units. Stylized reconstruction based on National Association of Home Builders data. My aim across parts 1 to 3 of this series is to build a political economic model of urban form, a model that explains what gets built in a city and who ends up occupying it from a set of form side and use side variables. On the form side are the rules, institutions, and financial structures that determine what kind of building can be produced. Plot structure, ownership law, building codes, lease length, credit, developer scale, and regulatory envelope. On the use side are the variables that determine who occupies that form: household structure, tenure, rent levels, income distribution, migration, demographic pressure, and the relationship between land, debt, and income. The ambition is that the same framework should be able to take Paris in 1865, Berlin in 1900, Madrid in 1860, London in 1820, Berlin's 1853 Bauordnung, Moscow under Dolevo Stроительство, Singapore HDB, Dubai Marina, or Phoenix Build to Rent, and when plugged the relevant parameters, return not only the morphology visible on the ground, but also the tenure structure that inhabits it. In other words, it is a parameterized model of urban production with named institutional inputs. The same variables should explain both 19th-century outcomes and contemporary cases, but before we can build that model, we need to clear the ground. We need to understand the forces and mechanisms that shaped these cities, and we need to examine the standard explanations for one of the most striking facts in modern urban history: the deep split between continental Europe and the Anglo world in the urban form that occupies the ordinary fabric of their cities. Why did one world produce apartment blocks, perimeter blocks, rental tenements, and vertical subdivision, while the other produced terraces, row houses, suburbs, leasehold estates, and later single-family sprawl? Why the usual answers fall short. The standard accounts of why Paris ended up apartments and London ended up rows fall into a handful of explanations, each commonly invoked in popular and academic writing. Walls and fortifications forced the continent up. Industrial pressure on scarce urban land drove density vertical, national character, sociable French, private British, produced its own physical taste. Long leasehold tenure made small plots inevitable in England. Fragmented ownership couldn't aggregate the parcel sizes Haussmann needed. Each of these accounts has merit and some explanatory power, but runs into an important case it cannot explain: the walls thesis. Continental cities were ringed by walls on the popular telling. Until late in the 19th century, scarcity drove up land prices inside the walls, and thus the only economical answer was to build up. This intuition was voiced by 19th-century reformers themselves. Martin Nadaud told the Chamber of Deputies in 1882 that the Thiers wall had left Paris choking in her straitjacket, and a residue of the argument survives in handbooks of European urban history.
Image. Paris is mapped with an outer fortification line encircling outlying districts and villages such as Auteuil, Passy, Montmartre, Belleville, Vaugirard, and Bercy. An earlier inner boundary surrounds the central city, showing how the later Thiers wall enclosed a much wider area beyond the dense core along the Seine.
Thiers fortifications in 1859, Paris in red. The trouble with this story is that the contrasted needs, walled continent versus unwalled Anglo cities, doesn't hold. English cities had largely shed their medieval walls by 1700. London's wall was already a relict feature by the Restoration. Gates were demolished in 1760, and Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool grew through the 18th century without any fortified perimeter. If walls had been the cause of apartment morphology, England should have produced row houses, which it did, while the continent should have produced apartments only while its walls still stood, which it didn't. The Mietskaserne and the Haussmannian immeuble arrived after the continental walls were down. The dating is wrong in both directions. Archival reconstruction of German defortification finds that the great majority of German cities had pulled down their walls long before the apartment block boom by 1816. Around 60% had already done so, and in Berlin the walls came down in the 1730s. Industrialization in the canonical sense did not begin until decades after the walls were already gone. A recent reconstruction of where Haussmann's new boulevards actually ran shows that about two-thirds of the new boulevard length passed through peri-urban land outside the inner city, farms, quarries, gardens, and another tenth through fully agricultural country. The Paris that Haussmann built was built mostly beyond the walls, not constrained inside them. The Hobrecht plan extended Berlin into open Brandenburg country, far past any meaningful fortification. If walls had been the cause, German defortification should have unleashed row house sprawl rather than Mietskasernen.
Image. In 1850, Paris had a continuously built-up central area, surrounded by peri-urban districts and outlying agricultural, quarry, and garden land. Major Second Empire Street investments spread across the existing core and into these outer districts, including the Boulevard Arago area in the south near the former course of the Bayev.
Paris Boulevard's construction commenced under Haussmann, compared with levels of urbanization. Source: Freemark et al., The Industrial Pressure Thesis. This story goes something like this. Industrial growth drove populations into cities. Cities had limited land. Vertical density was the rational response. The strongest counter-evidence to this is that British cities had the same industrial pressure and did not produce apartments. Bethnal Green, Whitechapel, the back-to-backs of Liverpool and Birmingham, the working-class districts of Manchester all reached densities that rivaled Berlin and Vienna, but in row house form. It is worth seeing this directly on a 0.36-hectare urban block, a typical continental 5-story perimeter block apartment, a single building wrapped around a central courtyard, in the form documented for Paris, Haussmann, Vienna, and Madrid, held around 500 to 680 people at late 19th century working-class occupancy, about 1,400 to 1,900 persons per gross hectare. The same block laid out as a British back-to-back district, about 100 narrow back-to-back houses in 4 parallel rows separated by narrow streets, held around 500 people at 3 stories, the standard Leeds and Birmingham form. Add a 4th story, as Liverpool's Central Court housing and the older East End working-class terraces routinely did, and the same 100 dwellings carry roughly 540 to 720 people, about 1,500 to 2,000 per hectare, squarely in the same band as the typical continental 5-story apartment, sometimes a touch above when British occupancy ran more cramped per person.
Image: a continental 5-story perimeter block apartment on a 0.36 hectare, 60-meter block houses about 500 to 680 people, or roughly 1,400 to 1,900 people per hectare. A dense British 4-story back-to-back block on the same land houses about 540 to 720 people, or roughly 1,500 to 2,000 people per hectare.
2 morphologies, 1 density band, a continental 5-story perimeter block apartment, and a dense British 4-story back-to-back district on the same 0.36 hectare block, both reaching densities of the same order of magnitude by completely different geometries. The British row house regime sat in the same density band as the typical continental apartment city, lower at 2 or 3 stories, in the same range at 3 to 4. Only the densest continental form, the 6-story Berlin Mietskaserne with its tight Bauordnung courtyards, ran significantly higher, around 2,200 per hectare, and the unregulated British slum extreme of the old nickel type climbed even higher by sheer overcrowding. What matters is that whatever produced the morphological split between an apartment city and a row house city, it was not density. It has to come from somewhere else. The cultural thesis. Aversion 1 often meets in middlebrow journalism reads the divide as a question of taste. The French live communally, the British live privately, and the buildings follow the temperament. The thesis is attractive, but it does not survive its counter cases. Belgium and France operated under the same Napoleonic Code from 1804, and yet produced predominantly row houses and apartment blocks respectively, same legal substrate, same broadly Catholic civil law culture, yet different urban forms. Brooklyn and Manhattan operated under the same New York statutes and produced row houses and tenements within walking distance of each other. No theory of national character survives these simple counterexamples. The tenure form thesis. Richard Rogers' Reconstruction of British Housing 1780 to 1914 reports a careful within-Britain comparison that ought to have killed the freehold vs. leasehold story. Freehold-dominated Leeds, with its prominent middle-class suburb at Headingley, and overwhelmingly leasehold Birmingham with Edgbaston, produced almost identical row-house middle-class suburbs. Tenure form taken on its own does not predict morphology. 2 cities in the same country with opposite tenure systems produce the same kind of street. The framework I will lay out captures this case by treating tenure as a use-side variable that interacts with the form-side capital stack rather than as an independent driver of form. The fragmented ownership thesis. According to this account, fragmented ownership produces small terraces of 4 to 8 houses, while larger holdings allow more consolidated development. This is a real argument, and it lights up one of the things going on, but it also fails as a master variable. Brooklyn was fragmented and produced row houses. Vienna's pre-1848 Vorstädte were also fragmented among petty noble and monastic landlords, and yet produced apartment buildings. The framework I will propose will attempt to explain Vienna by separating the scale of the city's overall ownership, fragmented in both Brooklyn and Vienna. From the scale of the actor at any single parcel, the Viennese Vorstadt landlord controlled a contiguous courtyard parcel. The Brooklyn freeholder controlled a frontage plot. The same concept, fragmentation, operating at two different scales, producing opposite outcomes. The zoning thesis. The contemporary Anglo-American argument points at the American single-family detached zoning regime that emerged after 1916 and made it illegal to build apartments in most American suburbs. As an account of why post-1916 American suburbs are detached house cities, this is empirically true and matters. As an account of why London, Manchester, Liverpool, and Brooklyn were already row house cities in 1852 generations before the first U.S. zoning ordinance, it cannot do the work. American zoning rules out the apartment in places that already weren't producing it. The morphological split is older than the law. Zoning enters our framework as one of the levers under the building code variable. It is a late-arriving regulator of a phenomenon whose original cause lies elsewhere. Each of the above accounts grabs one variable and treats it as primary. The mechanism I aim to propose treats them together within an interconnected hierarchy, and once that hierarchy is in view, I hope to arrive at a model with sufficient explanatory and predictive power. The framework. The architecture of the urban morphology model is hierarchical. At the bottom sits the inheritance regime. Civil law forced partition on the continent versus common law strict settlement in England. This is the substrate, a society's standing instruction to its propertied class about what kind of capital it is allowed to hold and pass on. From that substrate, three enabling conditions of construction follow within a form-side equation: who draws the block, what the building code permits on it, and at what scale the developer who builds on it is allowed to operate. The enabling conditions are funded by two financing flows: a builder-side credit channel that pays for the construction and a buyer-side credit channel that funds the eventual occupier. A political constraint: the rent control regime sits across the top of the stack and decides what return the building can earn once it stands.
Urban morphology equals F of block size times building code times developer scale times builder-side credit times buyer-side credit times rent control regime given inheritance regime.
The use-side equation hangs off the same inheritance substrate at its other end. The legal regime that tells the propertied class what kind of capital to hold also tells the dominant household what kind of asset to hold, and combines with tenure law and labor market structure to decide who lives in what gets built. Inheritance is one variable. Its two appearances at the bottom of the form equation and the bottom of the use equation reflect two scales of action that the same legal regime governs at once: the constitutional and the household.
Urban inhabitation equals U of tenure law times labor market structure given inheritance regime.
Image. An inheritance regime, ranging from civil law forced partition to common law strict settlement, sits beneath block size, building code, and developer scale as enabling conditions for urban form. Financing then divides between builder-side channels and buyer-side channels, while rent control shapes whether the outcome tends toward apartment blocks with rental tenure or row houses with owner-occupier tenure.
Schematic of the framework. Inheritance as substrate at the bottom. Enabling conditions of construction. Block, code, developer above it. Financing flows, builder-side, buyer-side. A political constraint, rent control, and the use-side variables, tenure, labor, inheritance, hanging off the same substrate. The single substrate is shared between the two equations through its two scales of action. With that architecture in view, let us introduce the form-side variables in the order they operate, from the planner's pencil to the politician's regulation.
Block size. How big is the parcel of land on which a single development sits, and who draws it? The main distinction we will return to is that in continental cities the state draws the block, while in Anglo cities the aristocratic estate parcels it out. Building code. The rules that decide what can be built on the parcel, including height, courtyard minimums, and lot coverage. For example, Berlin's 1853 Bauordnung permitted 6 stories with a 5.34-meter courtyard. London's Metropolitan Building Acts after 1844 capped heights and required setbacks. Developer scale, the size of the firm that does the actual construction. While a continental rentier corporation could finance and build a 6-story apartment block, a British master tradesman could finance and build 3 or 4 row houses at a time. Builder-side credit, the credit channel that funds the construction. On the continent, Prussian Pfandbrief-style covered bonds, long-duration bonds issued by a mortgage bank against a ring-fenced pool of urban property loans sold to bourgeois savers, with the bondholder paid out of the rental flow of the underlying buildings. On the Anglo side, improved ground rent capitalization, short-term lending against the present value of the rising ground rent, the completed houses will generate, advanced plot by plot rather than building by building. Buyer-side credit, the credit channel that funds the eventual occupier of the building. Building societies, savings and loans, FHA, Bauspar, CPF institutions that aggregate household deposits to lend back to households as mortgages. Rent control regime, the political constraint on what rent the building can charge once it exists. The broad pattern was a light regime before 1914 almost everywhere, tightening sharply after the wars and relevant again now.
And the use-side variables in the equation that decides how the form is inhabited.
Tenure law, what can legally be owned. An important case we will discuss. Horizontal property law makes individual apartment ownership possible, while its absence requires the apartment building to be rented whole. Labor market, whether tenants converge on a few per house pattern, middle class, or a many per room pattern, immigrant tenement. For example, the same row house can house one Brooklyn family or 12. Inheritance regime, as mentioned above, this regime determines if a household chooses, or has chosen for it by law, whether to hold its wealth in liquid divisible form or in dynastic landed form.
The framework's claim is that the continental apartment city of 1850 to 1914 is the case in which the form-side variables fall on the apartment side, and the use-side variables produce mass rental, producing the apartment block morphology. The Anglo-Dutch row house city is the case in which they fall the other way, producing the row house morphology. The interesting cases, Glasgow, Brooklyn, Buenos Aires, Vienna, before 1848, Amsterdam, distribute the variables across columns and produce hybrid morphologies. Glasgow is the cleanest illustration. Scots foo tenure and alienable perpetual rent freehold rather than the English 99-year leasehold. Scots inheritance law and the city's small jobbing builders sit on the row house side of the table, while ground annual capitalization and the sandstone block sizes negotiated by the Victorian estate offices push the form upward into the four-story tenement. The result is an apartment morphology grown out of row house legal material. Part 3 plugs the variables in for each of these hybrid cases explicitly, showing for each city which variables fall on the apartment side and which on the row house side. The same form and use equations account for the contemporary cases of parts 2 and 3 as well. Soviet microrayon, post-Soviet dotted high-rises, Hong Kong, Singapore, Dubai, the Sunbelt build-to-rent suburb. The rest of Part 1 begins at the bottom of the hierarchy, the inheritance variable, in its substrate role, and walks one variable up. Part 2 carries the chain through Berlin's particular history and turns to the two credit channels. It is also where a deposit-based versus bond-based mortgage institution typology gets unpacked alongside the builder-side and buyer-side channels, and where the post-war comparative political economy literature on the homeownership/welfare state trade-off connects to the tenure flip. Part 3 plugs the variables into the contemporary cases. Inheritance law, and the kind of capital it forces a society to hold. The inheritance regime is the layer most often skipped in popular accounts. It matters because an inheritance regime is, structurally, a society's instruction to its propertied class about what kinds of assets it is allowed to hold and pass on. The instruction differs sharply between civil law continental Europe and common law England, and the difference is the bedrock on which the form and use equations both rest. The French regime, forced partition. The popular story is that the French Revolution and Napoleon imposed forced partition, the rule that estates must be divided in cash-equivalent shares among all the children, out of egalitarian principle. The Code Civil of 1804 set the rule explicitly. A father with 3 or more children could freely dispose of at most a quarter of his estate by will, the quotité disponible. The remaining 3/4 had to pass in equal shares to the children. The function of the rule, however, was older and more specific than equality. It was a deliberate political dismantling of the institutional infrastructure of the ancien regime aristocracy. pre-revolutionary France was a legal patchwork. North of a line running roughly from the Loire estuary to Lake Geneva, customary law, coutume, prevailed, in which testamentary freedom was limited and customary partition rules applied unless the family used elite preservation devices. South of that line, the Roman law of testamentary freedom, droit écrit, survived from the Theodosian Code and gave nobles the legal tools to bequeath whole estates to a single heir. In both North and South, the Ancien Regime aristocracy used two specific instruments to preserve estates intact across generations: substitution fideikommissaire, a directive that an estate pass intact through a sequence of named heirs without alienation, and the majorate, the entailed estate attached to a noble title.
Image. Most northern and central France fell under droit coutumier, or customary law. Southern France, including the Mediterranean southeast and Corsica, fell under droit écrit, or written law.
Zone of customary laws, droit coutumier in the north and of written law, droit écrit in the south. Before the French Revolution, courtesy Maximilien d'Urbecker, the Constituent Assembly's decrees of March 1790 and April 1791 abolished primogeniture and substitution fideikommissaire together. The Code Civil of 1804 generalized the abolition into a permanent constitutional immunization, what historians have called the great demarcation of property from political power that defined the Revolution's deepest project. The réserve héréditaire, the three-quarters of the estate that must pass to the children, is the operational core of this immunization. A father cannot bequeath the bulk of his estate to a single heir, even if he wants to. Napoleon's Majorat's Imperio of 1808 briefly reintroduced an entail for the new imperial nobility, but the Restoration Charter of 1814 and the Law of 12 May 1835 abolished those majorats as well. By the mid-19th century, the reserva was uncontested. The downstream consequence of this regime is the decisive one for our story. A seigneur under the Ancien Regime could leave his domaine, a contiguous named, dynastically transmissible tract, to his eldest son, and the domaine would continue to function as the territorial base of the family. Under the Code Civil, he could not. The estate had to be divided into cash-equivalent shares, which meant either physical subdivision, selling pieces to outside buyers and distributing the cash, or formal partition, each heir receiving a defined parcel. Within a generation, the dynastic domain dissolved into smaller plots in scattered hands. The French aristocracy lost the territorial substrate of its political weight, exactly as the revolutionaries intended. Within a city, the same logic applied. A bourgeois Parisian holding a building under the Code Civil could not pass the building intact to one heir. He had to leave 4 children 4 cash-equivalent shares, which in practice meant either that the children sold the building to a third party and divided the cash, or that the building entered the hands of an institutional vehicle that owned it whole and issued the heirs 4 fungible shares in the vehicle. That institutional vehicle was the Compagnie Foncière, the joint stock urban property company. The 4 heirs each held, say, 25 shares in a company that owned 40 buildings. The same arithmetic of fractional ownership that would have been absurd applied to a single building. A quarter of a particular staircase, a quarter of a particular roof was rational at the company level. 25 shares in a 40-building portfolio is a tradable, mortgageable, marketable claim, valued daily, with a board of directors making the operational decisions on behalf of fractional shareholders. What made these otherwise absurd fractional claims workable was the governance layer the company supplied. A board of directors translates fractional shareholdings into coherent management of the underlying asset, and the shareholders can sell their fractions to a willing buyer rather than physically dividing the building. The institutional response to the réserve héréditaire was therefore the bourgeois rentier corporation, holding apartment buildings as undivided assets on its own books and offering its shares to bourgeois savers under the same partition rule. The English regime. Strict settlement. The English aristocracy in the 17th and 18th centuries built a different machine, the strict settlement. This was an elaborate trust device. The present holder of the estate was a tenant for life, entitled to the income of the estate during his lifetime, but with no power to sell the underlying freehold. The eldest son was a contingent remainderman, who would inherit the same life-tenant position on his father's death. The grandson was the next contingent remainderman, and so on. The present owner could not, by his own act, alienate the estate. Only a private act of Parliament could break the settlement and free the freehold for sale. The institution sat at the center of the political settlement that emerged from 1660 to 1688. The Restoration and the Glorious Revolution stabilized a bargain between the Crown and the landed class. The landed class kept its estates intact across generations as the territorial basis of its political weight in Parliament. In exchange, it accepted constitutional monarchy, parliamentary supremacy, and gradual reform. Strict settlement was the institutional infrastructure that contributed to preventing an English 1789. The aristocracy had a permanent territorial base, so a revolutionary expropriation of noble land was politically unnecessary. They could be managed within Parliament, and practically impossible. The trust law was robust enough that even Parliament needed a private bill to break it. Why did aristocrats accept that only Parliament could break their settlements? The answer is partly self-protection across generations and partly political. Strict settlement was, in the 18th-century sense, an insurance policy against one's own descendants. The tenant for life of a great estate held the income but could not sell the freehold or even grant a building lease longer than 99 years on his own authority. The eldest son in the next generation took the same restricted position. Any father in the family could therefore be confident that his grandson would inherit an estate roughly the same size as the one his own father had handed him. Even if his son turned out to be a gambler, a drinker, a sectarian enthusiast, or simply a fool. The fear of a profligate or extravagant heir is the recurring justification in 18th-century conveyancing manuals and family settlements. The family bound itself to the trust precisely because the family did not trust each of its own future members. Why was Parliament willing to be the bottleneck? Because Parliament was the landed interest. The same families who held the great estates sat in the Lords and dominated the Commons. Asking Parliament to break the entail was, in effect, asking one's peers to consent. The reconstruction of the parliamentary record shows that this consent was given liberally, where the purpose was development that increased the estate's long-term value. Urban building leases, drainage improvements, canal access, railway crossings. Parliament was not obstructing the great estates, it was performing the trust function the family wanted performed. The 99-year cap, the Private Act mechanism, and the Estate Acts together produced exactly the outcome the landed class had bargained for in the constitutional settlement, an aristocracy whose territorial base survived 1789 because no internal mechanism inside Britain could expropriate it without parliamentary consent, and parliamentary consent was theirs to give. Parliament supplied the release mechanism that kept the system from seizing up. Between 1600 and 1830, it passed roughly 3,500 estate acts, private bills that broke specific entails to release specific parcels for specific purposes, very often urban development. The Bedford Estates' release of land for Bloomsbury, the Grosvenor Estates' release of Mayfair and Belgravia, the Foundling Hospital Estate, the Mercer's Company's Stepney leases, the Portman and Cadogan Estates. Every great London estate in our story is a piece of land that was once entailed, then unfrozen by an Act of Parliament under strict settlement, then leased out plot by plot to small builders. A natural question arises. If aristocratic land was frozen in dynastic trusts, where did England's investable capital come from? England in the 19th century plainly did have liquid divisible capital, the joint stock railway, the foreign investment trust, the colonial development bond, consols, and the funds. Strict settlement bound the landed aristocracy's estates, but it did not touch the merchant banking and joint stock wealth held in the City of London, the square-mile financial district whose institutions had grown alongside, and largely separately from, the country estates since the 17th century. The two pools of capital developed in parallel rather than meeting in the same channel. Aristocratic urban land in London flowed into long ground leases on the Bedford, Grosvenor, Portland, and Portman estates under the strict settlement constraint, while bourgeois city capital went into railways, foreign loans, Indian and Egyptian bonds, and consols. The follow-on question is how the major early modern infrastructure projects in Britain, canals, factories, the first railways, were financed if aristocratic land was tied up behind strict settlement. The answer is that strict settlement constrained aristocratic land but did not freeze it absolutely, and in any case it applied only to the great dynastic estates, not to all English land. In the 18th and early 19th century, land, both settled aristocratic land and unsettled fee simple land held by smaller gentry and manufacturers, was used as security for industrial loans, but at the level of the individual landed industrialist and his country bank, not through a national mortgage bond market. The Duke of Bridgewater pledged part of his estate to borrow the £25,000 that built Britain's first canal in 1763, and used his political connections to obtain 4 Acts of Parliament that gave the canal company statutory powers to compel other landowners along the route to sell. Matthew Boulton sold and mortgaged most of his land, then raised £28,000 by pledging his wife's property to finance his first large factory in Birmingham. Jedediah Strutt raised loans against his farm to develop the stocking frame, whose profits later helped fund Arkwright's water and steam-powered textile factories. Examples abound. By one 19th-century computation, 2/3 of the capital available before the spread of large private banks existed in the form of real estate rather than financial securities. As late as 1832, land still represented half of all British wealth. What Britain did not develop was the institutional layer above the country bank, the standardized bond-issuing mortgage bank that could pool mortgages on land and buildings and sell long-duration paper into a capital market. That layer is what the German states had built in the Pan-Brief tradition and what France built around the Crédit Foncier in 1852. Britain built no equivalent. When the moment came that might have called for it, the railway boom of the 1830s and 1840s, the railway companies were raising capital on a scale that no land pledge country bank channel could have supplied, and they raised it instead by issuing shares and bonds against projected toll, fare, and freight receipts on the joint stock model accelerated by the Limited Liability Act of 1855 and the Joint Stock Companies Act of 1856. On the continent, the bond mortgage layer did get built, the Prussian Landschaften, beginning in the 1770s after the 7 Years' War, were cooperative mortgage associations that issued covered Pfandbrief against East Prussian Junker estates and resold the paper into Berlin and Hamburg. France's Crédit Foncier, founded in 1852 under the Second Empire, took bond-financed mortgage Credit National, and by the late 1860s had become central to the financing of Haussmannian construction, holding some 398 million francs of City of Paris paper by 1868. Spain's Banco Hipotecario de España of 1872 then took the same architecture into a Madrid that had been opened up by the Liberal Desamortización of 1836 to 1855. The shared institutional feature here is the bond-issuing layer above the country bank. The continental world had no bifurcation of land-based and merchant capital, as was the case in England. After the Reserva Hereditaire, disentailed land and bourgeois capital met in the same place, the urban block, and the apartment building was the meeting room.
Image. Under the Code Civil, a parental estate is divided into equal 1/4 shares, which flow into a rentier corporation holding a portfolio of apartment buildings with divisible cash flow and tradable shares. Under strict settlement, land passes intact through successive life tenants, from Generation 1 to Generation 3, leaving a single, undivided freehold tied to a country estate and 99-year building leases.
The continental regime left, the parental estate breaks into cash-equivalent shares among the heirs every generation, pushing the propertied class into liquid divisible assets, shares in the Compagnie Foncière holding a portfolio of buildings. The English regime right, the parental estate passes intact across generations as a life tenancy held in trust, and the propertied class retains a dynastic territorial base across the long 19th century. An educated reader will rightly object that English gentry land was not bound by strict settlement, and that significant urban land was held in fee simple outside the great dynastic estates. The objection holds, inheritance regime is the substrate, not the whole mechanism. The natural experiment we can look for is internal to England itself. Leeds and the West Riding were freehold cities with no dominant aristocratic ground landlord, yet they produced the densest back-to-back terraces in Britain. This is well documented. serious housing deficiencies were not confined to one type of tenure or location. Poorly drained areas were developed for industrial purposes or working-class housing, irrespective of who owned the land, how concentrated the ownership was, or the nature of the tenure, and freehold-dominated Leeds and overwhelmingly leasehold Birmingham produced almost identical middle-class suburbs. The strict settlement of the great estates was therefore one filter among several, not a single sufficient cause. The row house outcome was overdetermined by a stack of mutually reinforcing institutional conditions, which this article series will work through in turn. Inheritance comes first because it is the deepest layer, the legal architecture of property itself, but it does its work only in combination with what follows. A paradox worth pausing on. Read against each other. The two regimes seem to produce the opposite of what they should. England's strict settlement preserved aristocratic estates intact across generations. The Bedford and Grosvenor freeholds in 1900 looked very much like the Bedford and Grosvenor freeholds in 1700. The Revolution and Napoleonic inheritance law in France weakened the aristocratic estate system in a different way. Feudal rights were abolished. Roughly 6.5% of French territory was auctioned off from confiscated church land between 1790 and 1796. Another 3.5% from émigré property between 1793 and 1815, and equal shares inheritance under the Code Civil, made large dynastic landholdings harder to preserve across generations than they had been under the Ancien regime. By the late 19th century, the aristocracy still owned land, in some regions, a great deal of it. But the dynastic domain as a coherent territorial unit had been broken down into smaller, separately titled parcels that often passed through the market between generations. Thus, the Anglo regime kept estates large, whereas the Continental regime did not. And yet the Anglo regime produced cities built on small plots, Bloomsbury's 22-foot frontages, the Mercer's Company's 6 houses per builder, the Brooklyn brownstone, while the Continental regime produced cities built on large blocks, Haussmann's superblock-scale apartment buildings, the Hobrecht plan's 5-hectare blocks in Berlin, Cerda's 113-meter square in Barcelona. How can holding large estates intact produce small development parcels, and breaking estates up produce large development parcels? The resolution is in the legal monetization routes each regime made available. The English aristocrat under strict settlement could not sell his freehold. He was a life tenant under his own family's trust. He could grant building leases, but conveyancing practice as it had evolved since the early 18th century building booms in London and Bath limited the maximum term to 99 years on his own authority. The first 99-year building lease in London was granted on the Bedford estate at Bedford Square. By 1765, the Bath Corporation was granting 95% of its leases on that term. The Settled Estates Act of 1856 and the Settled Land Act of 1882 later codified this conveyancing practice into statute. Longer leases required a private estate act of Parliament. The only available counterparty for a building lease was the master tradesman with 3 to 6 plots of working capital, a class of builders that had emerged out of the British construction apprenticeship system in the 18th century, and that we'll look at directly in a moment. The aristocrat's estate stayed large, but the legal instrument forced its urban development to come out small. In France, by contrast, the Réserve héréditaire freed aristocratic land into a market of bourgeois proprietors with fungible savings. The state inherited the urban planning role that the aristocracy had vacated, and the state then exercised it at a much larger scale than any private aristocrat would have. Haussmann's prefecture, Hobrecht's commission in Berlin, Cerda's Barcelona and Sanche, Castro's Madrid. These are state actors drawing blocks at a scale that no aristocratic estate office had ever attempted. The estates were broken up, but the development parcels were not. Instead, they were drawn by the new state. So, the apparent paradox is 2 complementary stories. In England, the same legal machinery that protected aristocratic estates from being broken up forced their urban development to be parcel by parcel. In France, the same legal machinery that broke up aristocratic estates put the state in charge of urban planning at a much larger scale. The aristocracy was the unit of urban development in England. The state was the unit in France. The size of the development parcel follows directly from which actors' hands held the pencil. The urban development mechanism for a London estate ran in 5 steps, and the geometry is worth tracing precisely. First, an Estate Act of Parliament unfroze the entail for a specific tract, the parliamentary safety valve we discussed. Then the Estate Office laid out a street grid and subdivided the tract into building plots. The estate signed building agreements with master builders to take substantial blocks of land and develop them under the estate's overall plan. The builders in turn sublet plots to smaller speculative builders, sometimes also supplying capital and materials. James Burton, for example, erected over 900 houses on the Bedford and Foundling Hospital estates in the decade ending in 1803 on this model. Each house, when finished, was granted a 99-year building lease. The master builder then occupied it, sold the unexpired lease to a purchaser, or let it on shorter subleases. The streets, sewers, and pavements were laid by the Estate Office, the plots filled in plot by plot, never as a single contiguous structure.
Image: an entailed estate is first opened by an Estate Act, laid out as a street grid, and then subdivided into 22-foot building plots. Master tradesmen begin building on groups of plots, and the completed estate is filled in by multiple builders working on separate blocks.
The London estate development sequence, from left to right, the entailed estate as a single large tract. The Parliamentary Estate Act unfreezes the entail, and the surveyor lays a street grid. The tract is subdivided into 22-foot frontage building plots. Clusters of 3 to 6 adjacent plots are released to individual master tradesmen who erect the houses. The completed estate is filled plot by plot, each tradesman's cluster shown in a different color. The case of Bedford Square. Bedford Square, 1775 to 1780, designed by Thomas Leverton and built principally by William Scott and Robert Crews under building agreements with the Bedford Estate Trustees, is the canonical worked example. The square is roughly 158 by 97 meters between the houses, enclosing an oval communal garden of about 114 by 78 meters. All four sides are built up, 54 uniform four-story terrace houses with stucco pedimented centerpieces on each elevation, plot frontages of roughly 22 to 30 feet, every house fronting onto the estate-owned garden. The total footprint of the whole rectangle is about 1.5 hectares, well into the scale at which continental cities were building perimeter block apartment buildings around courtyard atriums, yet it produced 54 row houses instead. The reason for that is the next question.
Image: Bedford Square consists of continuous terraces of townhouses enclosing a large communal garden filled with mature trees. The surrounding streets and buildings sit tightly around the square, emphasizing its form as a row house perimeter rather than an apartment block.
Bedford Square, courtesy Arquiscopio. Why no apartment block developer ever emerged in England? Granted that strict settlement prevented the aristocrat from selling the freehold, and granted that the 99-year cap forced him to lease rather than sell, the leasehold could in principle have been a single big lease over 100 acres to one large developer who would have built an apartment block. He had the freehold. The trust permitted a 99-year lease. Nothing in the legal architecture of strict settlement required that the lease be granted to 50 separate small builders rather than to one large one. So why was it never granted to one large developer? A set of interlocking constraints answers the question, and once they interact, the small plot leasehold becomes the only equilibrium the British institutional landscape could support. Counterparty risk under strict settlement. The estate's freehold sat in a multi-generational trust whose duty was to provide steady, predictable income for the life tenant, the widow's jointure, the younger son's annuities, and the contingent remaindermen across decades. A single big developer would concentrate the entire revenue stream on one counterparty for the duration of the lease. If the developer failed, the estate's income failed with him. Spreading the lease across 50 master tradesmen, building 5 houses each diversifies the risk down to the household level. The Bedford and Grosvenor offices both use the small lessee pattern that is documented across the survey of London volumes on those estates. The fiduciary logic that produced the pattern follows from the legal structure of strict settlement itself. The absence of a credit instrument for apartment block construction in Britain. A row house in the British speculative regime was a short-cycle product. Statistics on Camberwell show that at the 1878 to 1880 peak, more than half of the borough's builders completed 6 or fewer houses in a year and turned their capital over inside it. A multi-story apartment block was a longer and more capital-intensive proposition. Construction cost outlays, ground rent payments, contractors' bills, and the timing risk of vacancies at completion were spread over several years. In France, that risk was absorbed by the Crédit Foncier, which discounted bonds de délégation issued by the City of Paris to Haussmann's contractors. The bank held 398 million francs of City of Paris paper by 1868. In Germany, it was absorbed by the Pfandbrief market. The Frankfurter Hypothekenbank of 1862 was the first of about 40 private mortgage banks that by the beginning of the 20th century were concentrated almost entirely on real estate financing in rapidly industrializing cities, lending against apartment buildings continuously flowing rent payments, the canonical example of that collateral being the 4 to 5-story rental blocks of the Berlin Wilhelmine Ring. In Britain, no equivalent instrument for apartment block scale construction emerged, and the reason was institutional. The Bank of England, chartered in 1694 to fund William III's war against France, grew up as the financial arm of the Whig public credit coalition that emerged after the Glorious Revolution. Its early directors were drawn predominantly from the Whig Party, and its capital was lent almost entirely to the state. Private business, including early forays into mortgages that appear briefly in the bank's 18th-century minute books, was a sideline that soon fell away. Its rivals were Tory-leaning land bank schemes of the 1690s and, briefly and disastrously, the Tory-led South Sea Company of 1719 to 1720. The bank's operating culture was set by these origins. It made its money discounting short-term commercial paper, bills of exchange drawn on actual goods in transit to be repaid out of the proceeds of the sale within weeks or a few months. This was reinforced and codified by the Bank Charter Act of 1844 and the broader real bills doctrine that governed 19th-century English central banking. Multi-year mortgage credit on urban property was simply not what the bank's discount window was designed for. France's Crédit Foncier of 1852, by contrast, was deliberately built around long-duration property credit. It was a state-supervised mortgage bank that issued bonds, the obligations foncières, against a ring-fenced pool of urban property loans, sold the bonds to French rentiers, and used the proceeds to fund Haussmannian construction under the Second Empire. The two institutions emerged from opposite political economies, and their attitude toward urban real estate finance followed. The country banks lent on short maturities. Their funding base was local deposits, withdrawable on demand, and their reserves were thin. Most of their lending was the discount of bills of exchange, the dominant instrument of British short-term credit through the Industrial Revolution. Lending against a construction asset whose first cash flow would arrive only after years of building, and whose underlying collateral, the unfinished building, was illiquid until completion, was not what country banks did, and not what their depositors would have tolerated. A developer who wanted to operate at apartment block scale in 1860s, Britain would have had to fund the multi-year construction window from his own balance sheet. The largest British builders did exactly that at the terrace house scale. James Burton erected over 900 houses on the Bedford and Foundling Hospital estates in the decade ending in 1803, and Thomas Cubitt undertook the almost single-handed creation of Belgravia and Pimlico from 1824 onward on Crown and Westminster leased land. Their working capital was partnership equity recycled through ground rent collections rather than long-duration debt secured against future rental flow. The British credit system did not offer the latter instrument. A clarification is worth making before moving on. The continental side did not lack small builders. Berlin, Paris, and Madrid had the same long tail of jobbing masons, plasterers, carpenters, and joiners that London did. Individual building sites in the Wilhelmine Ring or on Haussmann's boulevards were built by many small specialist trades, exactly as in Camberwell or Bloomsbury. What differs across the two systems is not the distribution of construction firm sizes, but the unit that capital flowed to. In Berlin or Paris, the financed unit was the apartment block. A Pfandbrief mortgage bank or the Crédit Foncier lent against the building. A Baumeister or a development company assembled the trades, and the small contractors worked beneath that umbrella. In Britain, the financed unit was the row house cluster, A country bank lent against improved ground rents on 3 to 6 terrace plots, and the small master tradesman of those plots was the principal developer in his own right. The same trades existed on both sides of the channel. The institutional unit they aggregated into apartment block on one side, row house cluster on the other, was set by the credit architecture, and that unit in turn set the built form. The exit problem. Once an apartment block was built, the developer had two ways out. He could keep it on his own books as a rental-yielding asset, becoming a rentier corporation in the continental sense, or he could sell off individual units to occupier households. Both exits were closed in Britain. Becoming a rentier corporation in Britain would have required either a Pfandbrief-like refinancing mechanism, which never developed, or a class of bourgeois savers willing to hold equity in a company against its recurring apartment rental yield. However, the British saver of 1900 faced an unusually broad and liquid global menu. The British exchange system listed thousands of quoted securities across London and the provincial exchanges. The official London Stock Exchange list itself ran to several hundred domestic companies, with the stock exchange official intelligence tracking thousands more issues, including a large share of foreign government and colonial bonds. Foreign sovereign and colonial debt traded at meaningful yield spreads over consols. A reasonable central tendency for the period is 4 to 6% on foreign sovereigns and Indian Railway debentures, compared with 2.75% on consols themselves, and the 3.5 to 4% yields then available on top-grade German Pfandbrief paper. Consols traded continuously with dividends paid net of tax through the Bank of England, in practice an administratively light asset for the British holder. A domestic apartment rental company would have had to compete against this menu on yield, liquidity, and perceived political safety. The French saver had a narrower domestic menu. The official Paris Parquet listed around 815 securities in 1900, plus another 396 on the unofficial coulisses, but he was not captive. Russian sovereign bonds in particular were the first-choice foreign allocation for French savers, accounting for roughly a quarter of French foreign investment by 1914. The Crédit Foncier enjoyed a privileged state-anchored, retail-friendly funding channel for its obligations foncières, rather than a captive demand pool. The directionally right comparison is therefore that London's saver had a broader and more liquid global menu, which made the domestic apartment rental company a poor fit on every saver-side dimension. Paris's saver was also globally exposed, but more easily channeled into state-linked renties, railway paper and Crédit Foncier bonds. Joint stock company formation in Britain has its own story. Recent economic history work has shown that the 1720 Bubble Act, often invoked as a constraint on joint stock formation, was in practice practically a dead letter, only one prosecution in the entire 18th century, and the act was repealed in 1825. The point is therefore not that British company formation was legally blocked. It's that the British capital that would have funded apartment block companies in 1855 had already been committed to railway construction in the 1830s and 1840s and to colonial and foreign government issuance in the 1840s, 1880s. The Continental Joint Stock Urban Property Company emerged in parallel with the railway era. In Britain, the railway era came first, absorbed the available joint stock capital, and the urban property company era never followed. The City of London Real Property Company, founded 1864, is a partial counterexample, but it concentrated on commercial property in the city, not residential apartments, and at a scale and order of magnitude below the Compagnie Foncière. The British bourgeois rentier did not lack appetite for urban property paper out of culture or temperament. The alternatives on offer were simply better assets on every dimension that mattered to him: yield, liquidity, tax treatment, and administrative simplicity. Selling off individual apartments was foreclosed by a separate gap. English law did not recognize divisible by floor freehold or leasehold ownership before well into the 20th century. There was no legal instrument by which a developer could sell apartment number 3 of building number 7 to a household buyer. Flying freeholds existed in narrow exotic cases and were not bankable. The Land Registration Act 1925 and the Commonhold and Leasehold Reform Act 2002 are the late legal interventions that finally created that instrument. The institutional landscape was already taken up. By the 1820s, when the great Bedford and Grosvenor releases were unfolding, The master tradesman regime was in place across London. Estate offices had decades of experience contracting with master tradesmen. Surveyors knew how to lay out small plot grids. Solicitors specialized in 99-year leases and improved ground rent capitalization. Country banks knew how to lend against these structures. Any apartment block scale entrant in 1875 would have found no available estate land. It was all under existing 99-year leases, no available credit channel, no construction firm at scale, no available exit, and a labor market unfit to support him. The path dependence is concrete and dated. A developer with the right idea in 1875 could not assemble the supporting institutions in time. Take any one of these constraints on its own, and an apartment block scale developer might still have emerged in Britain. Take all of them together, and the small plot leasehold tradesman regime was the only equilibrium the institutional landscape could support. The legal machinery that protected the great estates' freeholds across 3 centuries was the same machinery that forced their urban development to come out plot by plot for those same centuries, not as a circular outcome of the existing regime, but as the precipitate of concrete institutional features, the absence of any one of which would have changed the outcome. Vienna before 1848, apartments without modern finance. To add to the complexity, it turns out the continental story has a deeper origin than the Code Civil. Vienna had apartment morphology 2 centuries before bond markets reached it. The Habsburg states' Hofquartierwesen, the imperial court billeting system administered from the Hofquartiersamt since the 16th century, obliged the owners of taxable bürgerliche houses inside the walled city to set aside rooms for the court's quarter-entitled retinue, while properties belonging to nobility, clergy, the university, and other public institutions were exempt as Freihäuser. The structural significance is in the share of the housing stock the system touched. Starhemberg's 1637 survey found that of the city's roughly 1,210 inner-city houses, 477 acknowledged the quartier obligation, while 733 claimed quartier freedom. By approximately 1,550 inner-city houses were paying taxes to the city. About 40% of the housing stock therefore bore a permanent billeting obligation that impaired its use value and resale price, while the other 60% enjoyed an exemption relieving such pressures. The market response was systematic. Nobles acquired bürgerliche houses and rolled them into palais precisely to extract the quarter freedom grant, in what the city repeatedly protested as the incorporation of townsmen's houses into noble palaces. And what the Crown itself eventually conceded was pricing city real estate out of the reach of most ordinary citizens who now had increasingly to look to the suburbs for housing they could afford. Crucially, the building type that was being incorporated and scaled up was already a vertically stacked, multi-tenant block. The standard substantial Viennese house, even before 1700, had ground-floor shops, stables, and artisans' workshops. The owner's principal floor above, and an upper story of small rental apartments, off which many owners of such buildings, particularly widows, made their living entirely from rentals.
Image. A grand Viennese urban palace stands between other multi-story buildings, with a formal facade, repeated upper-floor windows, and arched entrances at street level. People, horses, carriages, and delivery carts fill the street, placing the palace within a dense mixed-use urban setting.
The Palais Albrecht in Vienna, scanned from the book Verlorenes Wien, Adelspaläste vergangener Tag by Edgard Heider, Bolau, Vienna, 1984. The palais was the same form built grander, a larger courtyard, more stories, a noble family on the piano nobile, and the same upper-floor rental apartments above. When ordinary citizens were pushed into the Vorstädte, the suburbs, the same morphology, multi-story courtyard block, mixed use, rented apartment by apartment, was rebuilt at smaller unit size and multiplied across suburban land held by lay corporations, parish foundations, monastic orders, Mariahilf, St. Ulrich, Schottenfeld, and aristocratic investment vehicles such as the Liechtenstein's extensive and enormously profitable residential development in the Alsergrund. The Vorstadt Mietshaus was, in other words, the palais scaled down and repeated. The Bond Rentier channel of the Allgemeine Österreichische Bodenkreditanstalt arrived only in 1863 and layered modern capital onto an apartment morphology that the Hofquartier exemption had already produced. This case looks at first like a counterexample to our framework. The Vorstadt was fragmented among many landlords, yet produced apartment buildings. But this is the fragmented ownership thesis we discussed, the case where the scale of the actor at any single parcel diverges from the scale of the city's overall ownership. Both Vienna and Brooklyn were fragmented at the city level. The decisive difference is at the parcel. Each Viennese Vorstadt landlord, the Liechtensteins in the Alsergrund, a monastic foundation around its Vorstadt village holding, a parish corporation on its church lands, controlled a contiguous tract as a single integrated development unit, owning the land, commissioning the building, and managing the resulting rental flow under one roof, whereas in Brooklyn, the land passed through chains of speculative subdivision, original estate seller, then speculator, then developer, then small group row house builder. So the unit that finally got built was a 20-foot frontage row house in a group of 2 to 4, not a multi-story courtyard apartment block. The developer scale variable in the form equation reads on the parcel scale actor, not on aggregate city-level ownership. Vienna pre-1848 was an apartment city for the same structural reason that Berlin became one later in the 19th century. Large parcels in the hands of single agents, even when the agents themselves were dispersed across the city. Part 3 plugs the rest of the variables into Vienna, alongside the other hybrid cases. Madrid after the Desamortization. Madrid arrives at the same morphology as Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, by a fourth path, not revolution, not state-planned extension into farmland by an absolutist state, not a centuries-old institutional exemption channeling building to the suburbs. Madrid's path was liberal expropriation, the dismantling of church and feudal entail estates by successive Spanish liberal governments through statute, with the released lands sold to bourgeois proprietors at auction. The Desamortization of 1836 to 1855, literally demortmaning, breaking up estates that had been held in manos muertas, dead hands, by religious orders and feudal entails that could not legally sell, ran under Mendizábal in 1836, Espartero in 1841, and Meadows in 1855. A sequence of statutes placed the lands of religious orders and feudal entails on the open market, and the dissolution created a class of small to medium bourgeois proprietors with Roman law freehold title and liquid savings, facing a city about to expand outward. Carlos Maria de Castro's 1860 plan laid out the Madrid ensanche, literally widening, the formal urban extension plan, the same concept as the Parisian Haussmann boulevards or the Berlin Hobrecht plan, on large rectangular blocks of about 100 by 100 meters, with perimeter alignment required by the Ensanche Code, the new Banco Hipotecario de España of 1872, a state-supervised mortgage bank modeled directly on the French Crédit Foncier, supplied the long-duration bond-side credit. The bourgeois proprietors used family-owned immeubles de rapport, multi-story apartment buildings held by a family or company for the rental income, as their inheritance vehicles. Spanish civil law resembled the Napoleonic reserva in principle through the legitima, the equivalent forced partition share for the children. So the same partition logic operated. The Banco Hipotecario provided the financing channel that Crédit Foncier provided in Paris. The substrate, the block geometry, and the financing channel all pointed the same way, and Madrid became an apartment city built on the same machine as Paris and Berlin, even though the path to that machine ran through neither aristocracy nor revolution.
Image. An 1857 general plan for Madrid's expansion surrounds the older, irregular central city with a much larger planned district of rectangular blocks. The proposal extends the street grid around the existing core and reserves space for public buildings, parks, roads, and rail connections.
Expansion Plan of Madrid, 1860. Huddersfield as the within Britain control. Huddersfield supplies a useful within Britain control on what a tenure regime can and cannot do. The Ramsden estate held a near monopoly on the land around the town centre and operated under several leasing arrangements during the 19th century, including the 999-year leasehold that was the regional default in West Yorkshire. The 999-year lease is the interesting test point because it offers, in effect, near-perpetual tenure security, the very condition a developer financing a multi-story rental investment would want. If long-duration tenure alone could lift Britain into apartment block construction, this is where it would show up. It does not. Through every shift in the Ramsden estate's tenure form, the housing that came off the land remained the row house. The estate also yields a covenant test. At Primrose Hill on Whitehead Lane, the Ramsden boundary met the Lockwood proprietors' land along the same stretch of road. Between 1861 and 1865, the Lockwood proprietors permitted back-to-back houses, and 76 of them were built at an average of 65 square yards per house. The Ramsden estate prohibited back-to-backs by covenant, and the same stretch of road yielded only 6 through houses at an average of 253 square yards per house, a four-fold difference in density driven by covenant, not by tenure. Both sides are still the same building type, a row house, compressed or spaced according to what the covenant allowed.
Image. Around Victoria Road, Garden Street and St. Stephen's Street. Row houses are packed into short, tight terraces, with narrow plots and dense backland development. Around Primrose Hill Road and Greenwood Street, the same basic row house form appears on larger plots with more open ground and less continuous infill.
On the left, Lockwood owned estate land where back-to-backs were allowed, resulting in a much denser urban fabric with an average of 65 square yards per house. On the same map scale to the right, Ramsden held land where back-to-backs were not allowed, resulting in smaller densities with an average of 253 square yards per house. Source: Ordnance Survey 25-inch map, 1892 to 1914. The conceptual point this experiment controls for is what no single variable inside the English bundle can do. Vary the tenure form alone, and the row house remains. Vary the covenant alone, and the row house compresses or spaces out but remains. The continental apartment block requires the whole institutional bundle in alignment: forced partition inheritance, pushing capital into rentier corporations, fan-brief credit funding, multi-year construction against future rental flow, alternatively divisible by floor ownership law for the exit, and the rentier corporation or owner-occupier mortgage market to absorb completed buildings. Britain had none of those. Huddersfield shows that varying the English variables one at a time inside that incomplete bundle, even the most apartment-friendly tenure available, does not produce apartments. Wrapping up Part 1. Part 1 has so far set up the substrate and walked one variable up. Part 2 will carry the framework through Berlin's particular history from Frederick II's military finance to the Mietskasernen of the 1890s and turn to the builder side and buyer side credit channels, the mechanism by which a fan-brief bondholder in Hamburg priced a Berlin apartment block from standardized tables, and the mechanism by which a small London builder borrowed against future rack rents from a country solicitor are the two credit channels that put up most of the world's apartment and row house stock between 1850 and 1914. In modified form, they are still building both today.